Okay, colleagues, let's continue. So I want to stress again, I think this is a very good article. So this is an article by Christopher Bertram from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on the political philosophy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And I think the article is very good, but it's also fairly dry and fairly technical, and it kind of presupposes that you already understand Rousseau. So, you know, the best way to start reading Rousseau is actually to read Rousseau himself, especially the two books that we are interested in are The Second Discourse and The Social Contract. However, if you're looking for some easygoing introduction, I think Stephen Smith from the University of Yale, his lectures and his textbook, which is a transcript of his lectures, offer excellent introduction. So if you haven't read that, I suppose maybe you should go read that first and then come back to this text. Although we'll see how it goes. You know, everybody is welcome to join. Open. The University of Open Doors. Anyway, Rousseau's contribution to political philosophy are scattered among various works, most notable of which are Discourse on the Origins of Inequality, yes, Discourse on Political Economy, it's a separate work, The Social Contract, obviously, the considerations on the government of Poland, I think a very important work for our purposes, which shows Rousseau's conservatism, his caution and his conservatism. We'll get there. However, many of his works, both major and minor, contain passages that amplify and illuminate the political ideas in those works. His central doctrine in politics is that a state can be legitimate only if it is guided by the general will of its members. This is Rousseau's central doctrine. This idea finds its most detailed treatment in The Social Contract. In The Social Contract, Rousseau sets out to answer what he takes to be the fundamental question of politics, the reconciliation of freedom of the individual with the authority of the state. So this is the fundamental question of politics, the reconciliation of the freedom of the individual with the authority of the state. Again, Rousseau, as the philosopher of freedom, how can you be free and yet obey? How can our membership in society not compromise our freedom? That's the question. Is Rousseau successful? That's up to you, colleagues, to discuss in your essays, whether Rousseau is successful in this or not. This reconciliation is necessary because human society has evolved to a point where individuals can no longer supply their needs through their own unaided effort. This is a long story which begins with the population growth, this insidious type of interdependence, sort of negative, deleterious interdependence. Dependence on others, but rather must depend on cooperation of others. The process whereby, and again, the true social contract is how do you get rid of this deleterious interdependence and make this into a benevolent, beneficial interdependence. The process whereby human needs expand and interdependence deepens is set out in the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality. In that work, the final moment of Rousseau's conjectural history involves the emergence of an endemic conflict among now interdependent individuals, and the argument that the Hobbesian insecurity of this condition. Again, my strong contention is that Rousseau agrees with Hobbes on almost all the major points. There's some nuances in terms of disagreement, but most of the time, you should be able to see how Hobbes and Rousseau relate to one another. Anyway, so to get to this point of Hobbesian insecurity, and this condition would lead to the consent, would lead all to consent to the establishment of state authority and law, which is the, again, evil contract, as opposed to true social contract. These are not the words that Rousseau uses. These are the words that we employ simply to distinguish one from another. Because there are two contracts in Rousseau. It's important to remember two contracts. Again, I'm reading this text after the lecture, so I hope you remember what we talked about in the lecture. In the Second Discourse, this establishment amounts to the reinforcement of unequal and exploitative social relations that are now backed by law and state power. So unequal, exploitative, backed by law and state power. In an echo of Locke and anticipation of Marx, yes, very importantly, Rousseau anticipates Marx in so many ways. Rousseau argues that the state would, in effect, be a class state guided by common interests of the rich and propertied, and imposing unfreedom and subordination on the poor and the weak. The propertyless people, right? They consent to such an establishment because their immediate fear of the Hobbesian state of war. You see, again, we have to appeal to Hobbesian state of war in order to make Rousseau clear. Leads them to fail to attend to the ways in which the new state will systematically disadvantage them. So, kind of ideology, maybe. Right? So people are inattentive. They fail to attend to this exploitative character of the state because they're afraid to die. The social contract aims to set out an alternative to this dystopia. So we have the evil contract, if you want, and this is the true social contract. Aims to set out an alternative to this dystopia, alternative in which Rousseau claims each person will enjoy the protection of the common force while remaining as free as they were in the state of nature. Defend and protect the person and goods of each associate with the full common force, and by means of which each, uniting with all, nevertheless obeys only himself and remains as free as before. So these are the two provisions of the social contract, of the true social contract. The key to this reconciliation is the idea of the general will. Yeah. So in this sense, the general will is the central idea in Rousseau, and I hope you understand that. Right? That is, the collective will of the citizen body taken as a whole. The general will is the source of law and is willed by each and every citizen, which is why I say, yeah, there's general will, but there's my general will. It is willed by each and every citizen. So there is also, or at least on my interpretation, there's my general will, which is the same as your general will, and this is what makes it general. So in many ways, I feel that general will is analogous to commonality of interest, common interest. And Rousseau actually talks about common interest and even utility. He talks about this in the introductory passages of the social contract. In obeying the law, each citizen is thus subject to his or her own will, and consequently, according to Rousseau, remains free. Notice, in obeying the law, citizen is subject to his or her own will. Subjection to general will is not subjection to somebody else, but it is subjection to my will. My general will. Okay? My general will. When I obey the general will, I obey myself. I think this is very important to understand. Now, you could say, oh, Alex, this is impossible. This doesn't work. Rousseau solution leads to tyranny. I'm not sure if that's the case, but maybe, in the spirit of free and equal discussion, feel free to disagree with Rousseau, but you have to understand what is the point, what is the end goal, where he's trying to get. Rousseau's highest value, I would say, very clearly, is freedom. For Rousseau, just as for Marx, and probably just as for Hegel, right? The highest value is freedom. Freedom, not equality. Equality is important maybe in certain instrumental ways, but it's not the end goal. It's not the end goal. And in this sense, Rousseau is similar to Marx. Okay. So that's the goal. That's the task of Rousseau's political philosophy. How can we be free? So we have ideas of legitimacy, ideas of freedom. Okay. I hope we're taking this to heart, but also I hope that most of these ideas you find familiar because we talked about them before. Anyway, the idea of the general will. Rousseau's account of the general will is marked by unclarities and ambiguities. Yes, unfortunately, it's true, that attracted the interest of commentators. The principal tension is between a democratic conception. So this is the principal tension. Is between a democratic conception where the general will is simply what citizens have decided together. In the sovereign assembly, and an alternative interpretation where the general will is the transcendent incarnation of the citizens' common interest that exists in abstraction from what any of them actually wants. Yeah, you see? Kind of potential tension between the two. So is the general will simply the sum total of the will of the citizens in the democratic assembly, or is it some kind of transcendent metaphysical ideal? Very important question. Both views find some support in Rousseau's text. Both have been influential. Contemporary epistemic conceptions of democracy often make reference to Rousseau's discussion of Book 2, Chapter 3 of the Social Contract. These accounts typically take Condorcet's jury theorem as a starting point, where democratic procedures... Condorcet's jury theorem. Sounds interesting. So democratic procedures are conceived as a method for discovering the truth about public interest. Democratic procedure is conceived as a method for discovering the truth about the public interest. They then interpret the general will as a deliberative means of seeking outcomes that satisfy the preferences of individuals and render the authority of the state legitimate. Yes. The tension between the democratic and the transcendental conceptions, transcendental not in the Kantian sense here, clearly. Kant would say transcendent. So democratic and transcendental conceptions can be reduced if we take Rousseau to be can be reduced, right? If we take Rousseau to be arguing for the view that under the right conditions and subject to the right procedures, citizen legislator will be led to converge on laws that correspond to their common interests. Oh yeah, I like this interpretation. I like it very much. However, where those conditions and procedures are absent, the state necessarily lacks legitimacy, the evil contract. It's important to remember, again, Rousseau, true social contract versus evil contract, true social contract versus evil contract, right? So we're talking about a normative ideal, very importantly. And Rousseau says, upon close inspection, it will be found that very few states actually have laws, right? Rousseau is not idealistic in this sense. He understands that most states are not well governed, or at least that's his contention. On such a reading, Rousseau may be committed to something like an a posteriori philosophical anarchism. Very interesting words. A posteriori philosophical anarchism. Such a view holds that it is possible in principle for a state to exercise legitimate authority over its citizens, but all actual states, so in principle it's possible for a state to be legitimate, but all, or maybe almost all, because Rousseau will give some example, but almost all actual states are, and indeed all the states that we are likely to see in the modern era, will fail to meet those conditions for legitimacy. This is Rousseau's pessimism. Rousseau's pessimism and his individual, anti-political, individualistic anti-political solution to the problem of politics. And, if Marxists, if we believe that communism is also a normative ideal and is impossible compared to communism in Marx, then what kind of solution do we get from that in terms of Marx? Interesting questions. The answer is not necessarily clear, but something to think about, I think. Anyway, Rousseau argues that in order for the general will to be truly general, it must come from all and apply to all. So come from all and apply to all. This thought has both substantive and formal aspects. So, formally, Rousseau argues that the law must be general in application, universal in scope. The law cannot name particular individuals, it must apply to everyone within the state. Rousseau believes that this condition will lead citizens, though guided by consideration of what is in their own private interest, to favor laws that both secure common interest impartially and that are not burdensome and intrusive. So this is all very important. For this to be true, however, it has to be the case that the situation of citizens is substantially similar to one another. Common interest. The law cannot name particular individuals, must apply to everyone within the state. Compare this to Rawls. I think John Rawls is actually mentioned in this article. Well, I'm pretty sure I saw Rawls somewhere. Anyway. Rousseau believes that this condition will lead citizens... So it has to be the case that the situation of citizens is substantially similar to one another. In a state where citizens enjoy a wide diversity of lifestyles and occupations, or where there's a great deal of cultural diversity, or where there's a high degree of economic inequality, especially economic inequality, and again, say hi to Marx, it will not generally be the case, that the impact of the laws will be the same for everyone. In such cases, it will often not be true that a citizen can occupy the standpoint of the general will, merely imagining the impact of the general universal laws on his own case. So, and the question is, okay. So then Rousseau's solution, is very limited in scope, is limited in application, is limited in applicability. Can we have alternatives? Right? What about Hegel? What about Marx? Attempt to somehow solve Rousseau's problem, but in different terms? Maybe? Okay, so the emergence of the general will, procedure, virtue, and the legislator. Oh yeah, the legislator, very important. In the social contract, Rousseau envisages three different types or levels of will as being at play. Oh yeah. First, the individuals have their private wills. So I have my private will corresponding to my own selfish, I always like to say, narrow and short-sighted. Narrow, short-sighted interest, natural individual. Second, each individual, insofar as he identifies with the collective as a whole, assumes the identity of a citizen, has a general will. So I have my private will and I have my general will. Notice, my general will. I have my general will. Setting aside selfish interest, I would say again narrow selfish interest in favor of the set of laws that allow all to coexist under conditions of equal freedom. So I would say this is narrow selfish interest, and the general will is my true, long-term, broadly construed self-interest. The general will is in my self-interest as well. And third, and very problematically, the person can identify with a corporate will of a subset of the populace as a whole. So we have the private will, the general will, and the corporate will, all within the same body. Different, souls vying for control. Think of Nietzsche, Freud, Foucault, right? Internal conflict, internal psychic conflict between the three wills. The general will is therefore both a property of the collective and a result of its deliberations, and the property of an individual. So it's a property of the collective, the general will, and the property of the individual. But I kind of think that it's maybe best to think about this in terms of the property of the individual, but whatever. In a well-ordered society, there is no tension between the private and the general will. Oh yeah. I agree with this 100%. In the well-ordered society, my general will and my private will tell me to do the same thing. As individuals accept that both justice and their individual self-interest require the submission to the law, my self-interest require submission to the law, which safeguards their freedom by protecting them from the private violence and personal domination that would otherwise hold sway. Yes. Oh, I agree completely. In practice, however, Rousseau believes that many societies will fail to have this well-ordered character. Many societies will fail to, as he says, upon close examination, it will be found that very few states have laws. One way in which, they are lawless tyrannies then, right? Or something like that. One way in which they can fail is if private individuals are insufficiently enlightened or insufficiently virtuous, and therefore refuse to accept the restrictions on their own conduct which the collective interest requires. Another model of political failure arises where the political community is differentiated into factions. So we have basically possibility A and possibility B. Differentiated into factions, perhaps based on a class division between rich and poor, and where one faction can impose its collective will on the state as a whole. The social contract harbors a further tension between two accounts of how the general will emerges and its relation to the private wills of citizens. Sometimes Rousseau favors a procedural story, according to which the individual contemplation of self-interest, subject to the constraint of generality and universality and under propitious sociological background conditions such as rough equality and cultural similarity, so there are very important background conditions, right, will result in the emergence of the general will from the assembly of the citizens. Emergence of the general will from the assembly of citizens. Again, this procedural story. In this account, the emergence, so we have two accounts. So the first one is procedural. In this account, the emergence of the general will, there seems to be no special need for citizens to have any specifically moral qualities. The constraints of their choice should be enough. However, Rousseau also clearly believes that the mere contemplation of self-interest would be inadequate to generate a general will. This may partly concern issues of compliance, since selfish citizens who can will the general will might still not be moved to obey it. You can will but not be moved. Again, so it's like weakness of the will. Weakness of the will. Slavery to passions. But Rousseau also seems to believe that citizen virtue is a necessary condition. Citizen virtue is a necessary condition for the emergence of the general will in the first place. This presents him with a problem for which his figure of the legislator is the one attempted solution. Yes. As a believer in the plasticity of human nature, Rousseau holds that good laws make for good citizens. Good laws make for good citizens. However, he also believes that good laws can only be willed by good citizens. So there's a bit of a chicken and egg problem. And that in order to be legitimate, they must be agreed upon by the assembly. This puts him in some difficulty, as it is unlikely that the citizens who come together to form the new state will have the moral qualities required to will the good laws, shaped as those citizens will have been by unjust institutions. The legislator or the lawgiver, therefore, has the function of inspiring a sense of collective identity. So the lawgiver has the function of inspiring collective identity in the new citizens that allows them to identify with the whole and will be moved to support the legislation that will equally transform them and their children into good citizens. Which is, I want to stress, in your ultimate interest at the end of the day. In this story, however, the new citizens at first lack the capacity to discern the good reasons that support the new laws. At first, we lack the capacity to discern the good reasons that support the new laws, and the lawgiver has to persuade them by non-rational means to legislate in their own best interest. So the miracle of the lawgiver. A bit problematic, but discussions abound, right? So discussions about the lawgiver. The figure of the legislator is a puzzle. Like the tutor in Emile, the legislator has the role of manipulating the desires of his charges, giving them the illusion of free choice without really giving them free choice. Little wonder then that many critics have seen these characteristics in somewhat sinister light. Yes. In both cases, there's a mystery concerning where the educator figure comes from. Not just mystery. Rousseau says miracle. And how he could have acquired, so where does he come from, and how could he have acquired the knowledge and virtue necessary to perform his role? This, in turn, raises a problem of regress. If the legislator was formed by a just society, then who performed the legislator's role for that society? And how was it that the legislator formed? How did the tutor acquire his education? Who will educate the educators? Says Karl Marx. So again, these are questions. What are the answers? Well, I have some answers. Well, let's talk about this in the seminar. But it's definitely a very good question, definitely, and potentially a weak point in Rousseau's political philosophy. Let's continue. Next section. Rousseau's claim to reconcile freedom and authority. What then of Rousseau's key claim that freedom and authority are reconciled in his ideal republic through obedience to the general will? This claim finds notorious and deliberately paradoxical expression in Book 1 of Chapter 7, where Rousseau talks about this, forcing to be free. Can the individual be forced to be free when they're constrained to obey the general will? The opening words of the social contract themselves refer to freedom with the famous saying that man is born free, but everywhere he's in chains. This ringing declaration, however, is almost immediately followed by a very important note of paradox, as Rousseau declares that he can make this subjection in chains legitimate. Make this subjection in chains legitimate. That's the task of the social contract. How can we justify the chains? Man is born free, yet everywhere he's in chains. How can, those chains are most of the time illegitimate, but can they be made legitimate? That's the purpose of the social contract book. The thought that Rousseau's commitment to freedom might not be all that at first appears is strengthened by other passages in the book, most notably his declaration that those subject to the general will, are forced to be free. The value of freedom or liberty is at the center of Rousseau's concerns throughout his work, since he uses the notion in several distinct ways, though it is important to distinguish several uses of the term. So first, we should note that Rousseau regards the capacity for choice and therefore the ability to act against instinct and inclination as one of the features that distinguishes human race from other animals. Capacity for choice and therefore ability to act against instinct and inclination, as one of the features that distinguishes human race from animals, humans as opposed to animals, and makes truly moral action possible. Truly moral action possible. In the discourse on the origins of inequality, for example, he characterizes animal species in essentially Cartesian terms as mechanisms programmed to a fixed pattern of behavior. Human beings, on the other hand, are not tied to any particular mode of life and can reject prompting of instincts. We are free from instincts to some extent. This makes possible both the development of human species and also its fall from grace. So this is, again, something good, but also something bad. Since individuals can ignore the impulses, benign impulses such as pitié, for example, if they wish to. The freedom to act contrary to the mechanism of the sense and the power of willing and choosing for Rousseau is something entirely outside the laws of the physical world. Oh, this is such a problem. This is such a problem. Again, I want to say, yeah, Rousseau probably believes that human beings fall outside the laws of nature, but I also think that Rousseau's view can be reconciled in a sociological fashion because really human beings, are human beings really free? Human beings change, but mostly as a species. Change as a species, not individuals. Mostly, right? So it's less about freedom and more about cultural evolution, I would say. Again, this is my own pet concern because I both as a fan of Rousseau and as a determinist, I'm just trying to square Rousseau with determinism. But that's again, just a little aside. Anyway, so yeah, and therefore, human behavior would not be subject to scientific explanation. Yeah, not very good. And also I think not very Rousseauian, because how can we have science of humanity? Anyway, Rousseau also takes this freedom of choice to act as a base of all distinctively moral action. Again, not sure what this does, because freedom is actually obedience. And Rousseau talks about, again, utilitarian concerns, right? How justice and utility, right? Our long-term self-interest. I don't think that freedom actually plays an important role in Rousseau, honestly. So this is, again, I'm battling against Rousseau. I'm trying to read Rousseau against Rousseau, so take what I say with a grain of salt. Anyway, in The Social Contract, the connection between freedom of choice and morality is central to his argument against despotic government, where he writes that the renunciation of freedom is contrary to human nature, and that to renounce freedom in favor of another person's authority is to deprive all actions of morality. So basically, let me just write the word compatibilism with 3 question marks and leave this, okay? It's kind of, this is a concern for another course, okay? You don't have, you're not expected to discuss this in your essays. Here in the modern political theory course. Anyway, in Book 1, Chapter 8, Rousseau's True Social Contract, Rousseau tries to illuminate his claim that the formation of the legitimate state involves no net loss of freedom. So legitimate state involves no net loss of freedom. But in fact, he makes a slightly different claim. The new claim involves the idea of an exchange of one type of freedom, natural freedom, for another type, civil freedom. One type of freedom, natural freedom, for another type, civil freedom. Natural freedom involves an unlimited, this is important, unlimited right to all things, an idea that is reminiscent of Hobbes' right of nature. Again. Rousseau compared to Hobbes. In the Leviathan, since all human beings enjoy this liberty and right to all things, it is clear that in a world occupied by many interdependent humans, the practical value of that liberty may be almost non-existent, because if everybody has a right to everything, nobody really has a right to no particular thing. This is because any individual's capacity to get what he or she wants will be limited by his or her physical power and competing physical power of others. Further, inevitable conflict over scarce resources will put individuals against each other, so that unhindered exercise of natural freedom will result in violence and uncertainty. So it's against our interest to retain this natural freedom. Nothing good comes of it. This is how the Rousseau's criticism of negative freedom, if you want. Negative freedom as destroying itself. Negative liberty destroys itself. Only the rational liberty as obedience to the rational will that one has prescribed to oneself, only that makes man truly free. The formation of the state and the promulgation of laws willed by the general will transforms this condition. With a sovereign power in place, individuals are guaranteed a sphere of equal freedom under the law with protection for their own persons and security for their property, provided that the law bearing equally on everyone is not meddlesome or intrusive, and Rousseau believes it will not be, since no individual has a motive to legislate a burdensome law. There will be a net benefit compared to the pre-political state. Rousseau makes a further claim in the same chapter of the social contract, namely that the conditions of civil society, the citizens achieve moral freedom, by which he means obedience to a law that one has prescribed to oneself. Yes, again, a phrase I already used today, I believe. For discussion, see especially Neuhauser. Again, Neuhauser. We should probably look at Neuhauser. Although this latter claim is presented almost as an afterthought, it is the form of freedom most directly responsive to the challenge Rousseau had set for himself 2 chapters earlier, which involved finding a form of association in which each citizen would obey only himself. Right? Naturally, this raises the question of whether the citizen does in fact obey only himself when he obeys the general will. Does the citizen obey only himself when he obeys the general will? On the face of it, this claim looks difficult to reconcile with the fact of majorities and minorities within the democratic state, since those citizens who find themselves outvoted would seem to be constrained by a decision with which they disagree. Rousseau's solution to this puzzle is found much later in Book 4, where he argues that those who obey the laws they did not vote for remain bound by a will that is their own, since the democratic process has enabled them to discover the content of the general will, in which they had a share. Many commentators have not found this argument fully convincing. I don't really find this argument fully convincing either. I think that before we vote, first of all, there are conditions. Remember, conditions of the true social contract. And also we're talking about a normative ideal. And also this idea that before we vote, each consents to go along with the majority decision. So we could, again, if you want, remind me, we can unpack this during the seminar. So Rousseau's invocation of the 3 types of freedom, natural, civil, and moral, in the text of the social contract, can appear confusing. The picture is further complicated by the fact that he also relies on a 4th conception of freedom related to civil freedom, but distinct from it, which is nowhere named explicitly. This is the republican freedom, and consists not in being subject to my own will, but rather in the fact that law protects me from being subject to the will of any other particular person in the manner of a slave or a serf. So republican freedom is that the law, so I obey the law so as not to obey men. I obey the law so as not to obey a master as a slave. The law protects me from being subject to the will of any other particular person in the manner of a slave or a serf. Yes. To find Rousseau's explicit endorsement of this idea, we have to look not to the social contract, but rather to some unpublished notes. Yet, the concept is clearly implicit in the notorious Forced to be Free passage in Book 1, Chapter 7, since Rousseau explains that when each citizen is constrained to obey the general will, he is thereby provided with a guarantee against all personal dependence. Guarantee against all personal dependence. Yes. 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 Okay. Well, we're almost done. Okay. Let's push forward. Representation in government. One feature of Rousseau's political philosophy that has proved least persuasive to thinkers is his doctrine. So problems in Rousseau, right? Is his doctrine of sovereignty and representation, with his apparent rejection of representative government. At the center of Rousseau's view in the social contract is his rejection of the Hobbesian idea. So again, I think that Rousseau and Hobbes mostly agree, but sometimes they disagree, that people's legislative will can be vested in some group or individual that then acts with their authority but rules over them. Well, but Hobbes also has democratic sovereign, right? Hobbes on democracy, where we are ruled by a democratic assembly into which each has a right to enter. Instead, Rousseau takes the view that to hand over one's general right of ruling oneself to another person or body constitute a form of slavery, and that to recognize such authority would amount to an abdication of one's moral agency. This hostility to the representation of sovereignty also extends to the election of representatives, to sovereign assemblies, even where those representatives are subject to periodic re-elections. Even in that case, the assembly would be legislating on a range of topics on which citizens have not deliberated. Laws passed by such assemblies would therefore bind citizens in terms that they have not themselves agreed upon. Not only does the representation of sovereignty constitute, for Rousseau, a surrender of moral agency, the widespread desire to be represented in the business of self-rule is a symptom of moral decline and loss of virtue, that people don't want to rule themselves but represent, right? And I want to say, so again, British versus Swiss system in 2021, right? This idea that in Switzerland, even today, any law is potentially subject to a referendum. This is the system that Rousseau would favor. So it's fine if the parliament proposes a law, but the citizens must always be free to object. And again, the way this is done in Switzerland is that I think if there's like, let's say 10,000 signatures, which is a tiny percentage of the population, signed against any particular law, right? Then any decision of the parliament will go on to be voted on in the referendum by the population in its entirety. And this is the system I think that Rousseau would endorse. Okay. So the practical difficulties of direct self-rule by an entire citizen body are obvious. Such arrangements are potentially onerous, must severely limit the size of legitimate states. So we're talking about direct democracy, right? It is noteworthy that Rousseau takes a different view in a text aimed at practical politics. So we have this very important text, Considerations on the Government of Poland. Nevertheless, it is not entirely clear that the widespread interpretation of Rousseau as rejecting all forms of representation is correct. One key distinction in the social context is between sovereign and government. Let's not confuse sovereign and government. A very important distinction. The sovereign, composed of the people as a whole, promulgates laws as an expression of the general will. The government is a more limited body that administers the state. So this is basically the executive, right? State bound set by the laws, and which issues decrees applying the laws in particular cases. Issues decrees applying the laws in particular cases. This is the government. This is confusion. Many students are confused about this. It's a complicated topic. Please devote some time trying to unpack it. Right? If the laws are conceived of as the people setting a constitutional framework for society, so people setting a constitutional framework for society, with the government decrees comprising the more normal business of legislation, right? Then the distance between Rousseauian republic and a modern constitutional democracy may be smaller than it first appears. In effect, the institution of the sovereign may be inconsistent with a representative model where the executive power of the government can be understood as requiring it. Such a picture gains credibility when the details of Rousseau's views on government are examined. Although a variety of forms of government turn out to be theoretically compatible with popular sovereignty, Rousseau is skeptical about the prospects for both democracy. So Rousseau is skeptical about democracy, direct democracy, where the people conduct day-to-day running of the state and the application of laws, and also Rousseau is skeptical of monarchy. Instead, he favors some sort of elective aristocracy. Yes, the best form of government according to Rousseau. In other words, he supports the idea that the day-to-day administration should be in the hands of a subset of the population, elected by them according to merit. Yes. Too important. So not aristocracy of birth, but aristocracy of merit. People are elected according to merit. Two important issues arise in relation to Rousseau's account of relations between sovereign and government. The first is his concern with political pessimism, even in the case of the best designed and most perfect republic. Just as any group has a collective will, opposed to the individual or private will of its members, so does the government. As the state becomes larger and more diffuse, as citizens become more distant from one another, spatially and emotionally, so the effective government of the republic will need a proportionally smaller and more cohesive group of magistrates. So you understand, we're going to talk about the corporate will now. Corporate will drifting apart from the general will. Rousseau thinks it almost inevitable, that this group will end up usurping the legitimate sovereign power of the people and substituting its corporate will for the general will. Yes. The second issue concerns how democratic Rousseau envisages the republics to be. So this is the second issue. He sometimes suggested a picture in which people would be subject to elite domination by the government, since the magistrates would reserve the business of agenda setting for the assembly to themselves. In other cases, he endorses a conception of a more fully democratic republic. Okay. Although Rousseau rejects Hobbes's view of sovereign as representing or acting in person of the subject, he has a similar view of what sovereignty is. Again, you see, similar view of what sovereignty is and its relation to figures of the individuals. Again, I think that as long as you remember, so like Hobbes's account of democracy, Hobbes on democracy, is almost identical to Rousseau. So I think the disagreement comes when Hobbes thinks that monarchy or aristocracy is fine. Sovereign monarchy or sovereign aristocracy is fine. Whereas, sort of, if you think of Rousseau's sovereign democracy, if you want, sovereign democracy, then Rousseau and Hobbes are almost entirely in agreement. So Rousseau rejects the idea that individuals associated together in a political community retain some natural rights. So human beings, individuals have no right against the state. Rousseau and Hobbes agree. Rather, such rights as individuals have over themselves, land, and external objects are a matter of sovereign competence and decision. So we only have rights because the sovereign gives us rights. Compare Rousseau to Hobbes. Individual right must be specified by the sovereign in ways that are compatible with the interests of all in a just polity, and Rousseau rejects the idea that such rights could be insisted on as a check against sovereign power. Again, between the sovereign and the individual, who will be the judge? Back to war of all against all. Right? Okay, take this to heart. Comparing Rousseau and Hobbes. Will individuals have rights against the sovereign in communism? Will there be a sovereign in communism? Interesting questions. Wolf of Marx. Okay. We're almost done. Civil religion and toleration, complicated topics. The final full chapter of the social contract expounds Rousseau's doctrine of civil religion. Contemporary readers were scandalized by it, and particularly by its claim that the true, original, or early Christianity is useless in fostering the spirit of patriotism and social solidarity necessary for the flourishing of the state. Okay, patriotism and social solidarity, which are necessary for the flourishing of the state. In civic nationalism, if you want. In many ways, the chapter represents a striking departure from the main themes of the book. First, it is the only occasion where Rousseau prescribes the content of the law that a just republic must have. Second, it amounts to his acceptance of inevitability of pluralism in matters of religion, and thus rejects, the inevitability of religious toleration. This is in some tension with his encouragement elsewhere of cultural homogeneity as a propitious environment for the emergence of the general will. Third, it represents a very concrete example of the limits of sovereign power. Limits of sovereign power. Following Locke, Rousseau insists upon the inability of the sovereign to examine private beliefs of citizens. Well, is this really a limit? But that's impossible to do because it's impossible. Mind reading is impossible. Mind reading is impossible. Is this really a limit on sovereign power? Sovereign can also not really suspend the laws of gravity or laws of physics. Is this also a limit on sovereign power? Not sure. The tenets of Rousseau's civil religion include the affirmation of existence of supreme being and of the afterlife. So again, Rousseau's theology and theodicy are complicated. talk about theodicy means problem of evil. Problem of evil. If God is good, why is there evil in the world? Rousseau has this pessimistic solution that maybe God is not all powerful. God or nature in this quasi-Spinozistic fashion. Let me put it this way. Yeah. So the tenets of civil religion, and here we list them, right? Supreme being, afterlife, principle that just will prosper and wicked will be punished, and the claim that social contract and laws are sacred. Yes. We should, they should remind us a little bit of Durkheim. Society worshipping itself. This fundamental religiosity of sociality. In addition, the civil religion requires the provision that all those willing to tolerate others should themselves be tolerated. But those who insist that there's no salvation outside their particular church cannot be citizens of the state. So, intolerance for the intolerant, but toleration for the tolerant. The structure of religious beliefs within the just state is that of an overlapping consensus. The dogmas of civil religion are such that they can be affirmed by adherents of a number of different faiths, both Christians and non-Christians. Despite Rousseau's concern for religious toleration, both in the chapter and elsewhere, modern readers have often been repelled by one striking note of intolerance. Rousseau argues that those who cannot accept the dogmas can be banished from the state. This is because he believes that atheists, having no fear of divine punishment, cannot be trusted to their fellow citizens to obey the law. And this is, again, compare Rousseau here to Locke. Locke says something very similar. Locke, for the exact, atheists cannot keep promises. Rousseau goes even further to suggest death penalty for those who affirm the dogmas but later act as if they do not believe them. Yeah. Okay. Another important topic that has not been discussed here in the article is censorship. David Boucher in his chapter talks about this in detail. Okay, colleagues. Okay, I think this was a good article. It's a way of tying together the many disparate concepts that we have been talking about. As always, I hope this was useful. I hope this was stimulating. If you have any questions, let's talk about them in the seminar. Otherwise, thank you very much. Stay safe, take care, and I'll see you next time. Many disparate concepts that we have been talking about. As always, I hope this was useful. I hope this was stimulating.